In this segment, we're going to talk about design. How do you know whether design is there because of an intelligent designer or if design is there just because of a natural process? Honestly, we see patterns and our mind sees designs all around us. We're actually here at the Badlands National Park, which may seem like a strange place to start a talk on creation, but even these hills, as you look at the peaks and the valleys, you see different things. One person may see something that looks like a dragon's head or a castle or a profile of somebody's face, designs in the very rock layers. Now, this is a gorgeous area of sediment all around us with lots of patterns and crevices and craggy looking peaks. First of all, this area looks this way because all of this mudstone, it's very friable mud that is formed into a rock, which is constantly eroding away, has been washed away, leaving various peaks. Now, where did that mud come from? It's here because during Noah's flood, different types of sediment were laid down in different places all over the planet. In this particular area of South Dakota, very thick layers of mud were laid down that was turned into mudstone. Huge amounts of water rushed off the continents during the latter parts of the flood, carrying with it enormous amounts of sediment. But just like in any river, in certain areas, very deep gorges are carved out under the water, and in other areas of the same river you get sandbars and various peaks and valleys. In this area, high areas of sediment remain, and over the ensuing years it was eroded away, leaving a very gorgeous looking landscape. But let's compare that with other designs we see everywhere we look. You see, in order for a design to have intelligence behind it, there are certain hallmarks that characterize it. One of those is that there are multiple components making up the finished final article, picture, sculpture, or whatever. And the components come together to form the finished part. A mousetrap is an example. A mousetrap has a platform, a hammer, a spring, a catch, and a trigger. Now, without all 5 components, you don't have a mousetrap. It has to have all 5 in order to work. Another characteristic of design is that as you look closer and closer at the individual components, they become even more intricate in their appearance and construction. Third, they're very often quite beautiful or artistic, whereas natural processes don't tend to create beauty, but rather randomness. The individual parts are non-functional. In other words, an airplane is made up of enormous numbers of non-flying parts, and yet the final airplane flies. You see, you couldn't just bring the parts together one piece at a time to create flight. They all have to be there for the flight to happen. There is also a 5th characteristic, and that is natural processes do not produce the individual components. Now let's look at a couple examples. We'll start with simple things like a painting. A beautiful portrait has beauty. It has multiple brush strokes, multiple colors to make up the painting, and yet all of the individual components create beauty. They're all required to come together to create it. You can look at a painting and know it's obviously designed. And yet, if you just throw paint at a wall or paint drops out of a bucket, a pattern develops, but there's no intelligence that would have been required. It's very easy to distinguish between the two because the characteristics that characterize an intelligent design are present in the painting and they're not present in the splatters. Another example, if you look at a very classic cliff at Pictured Rocks National Seashore up in Michigan, there's one outcrop that sticks out toward the water of Lake Michigan that's called Indian Head Rock. Now, if you look at that, it very much looks like an Indian head. Well, the question is, was it designed by natural processes or did someone carve this Indian head? Well, once again, let's apply these characteristics. Now, as you look at Indian Head Rock, There is softer rock underneath the nose and the chin area. There's softer rock in the forehead, in those areas, and they eroded away by the wave and in action. A harder layer of rock was there in the area that formed the nose. So by very natural processes of erosion, the softer areas eroded away, the harder areas eroded slower, and you ended up just by random processes of a cliff profile that looks sort of like an Indian head. Now let's compare that with a buffalo nickel. From 1913 up until 1938, the United States was producing nickels with a buffalo on one side and a classic Indian profile on the other side. Now if you look at this, you find a very similar profile to what we saw on that cliff face. But here we have a metal object which has no inherent properties that would cause it to erode away and form a picture of a human being or an Indian head. Furthermore, as you look closer and closer to the very minute details, you find fine little lines and carvings that were either pressed out or embossed to form an image of an Indian's head. Very, very different, because this was a designed by intelligence object and the cliff was not. A third example might be something as complex as this mantle clock. Now if you look at this clock, it has many, many different components. Not just 5 like a mousetrap or just a few rocks that are eroded away, but it has to have a clear face and has to have hands and a beautiful cabinet that fits into it. There are dozens and dozens of parts. But it gets even more complex, because as you then look inside of the working mechanisms of the clock, what you find are perfectly formed gears, each one an exact size and shape, each one fitted to a shaft in a perfect position, each gear interlocked with another gear, all of them designed to work together and turn exactly as a pendulum swings as they ratchet forward in order to maintain time. So you have beauty, you have individual components that are non-functioning to keep time, you have multiple components required to produce the final product, all of it not occurring naturally. So it is obvious that design is part of it. Now let's take these principles and apply them to life. Any form of life, even the most simple single-celled organism, is made up of multiple components that don't occur naturally. Complex forms of life are all the parts have to be there or it could never be alive. The closer you look at any form of life, right down to the molecular level, it becomes more and more increasingly intricately designed, crafted, and placed together. So on a biological level, life shows all of the hallmarks of an intelligent designer that would have created it. So the question is, could it have made itself? Now I'd like to do experiments. I've used science all my life, so I thought, how could you figure out, has the components of life come together or not all by themselves to have formed a working, finished form of life? So I like to do an experiment which I call the magic can of evolution. So I've got a magician here and he's pulling different forms of life out of his hat. Now I thought, well, I don't have a form of life that I can pull out of my magic can, but I'm going to dump everything out of my can, and what's in it is actually a pen. Now if you think about an ink pen, it is a small little machine. It's a working, functioning whole made of multiple parts. So the question is, could something even as simple as a working ink pen ever produce itself by random natural processes? Well, let's just pull it apart. We've got a pen, it has a tip, it has an ink cartridge, it has a tube which holds everything together, and inside of the tube there's a button to help it click, a little mechanism so it goes click, 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 and then a clip to put it on your pocket. So we actually have all of the parts needed to make a working ink pen inside the can. Now you already have a problem, because none of these parts could have made themselves. They don't occur naturally. And by the way, every chemical that we find in every living organism throughout our biosphere of the Earth is made of components which do not occur naturally. You see, they only occur inside of living organisms. They're made by the organisms that are already alive. They don't just float around out there, just like the parts of the pin aren't floating around. But even if you have all the parts, and even if you put those parts in an enclosed space, and even if you could add energy, like by shaking the can, or tossing the can, or spinning the can, or let's say I shook this can for about 1 billion years. This is going to be a very long class today. Time isn't the answer. Will the parts ever come together to form a working pin? And I think you inherently know the answer. Absolutely not. Yet, in every biology class in the nation, in every textbook on biology, the students at the beginning of the section on life, they'll read about an experiment done in 1952 by a man named Stanley Miller. It's the Urey-Miller experiment, where they put methane gas and hydrogen and ammonia in a flask, and they circulated the gases around, and they'd add an explosive spark of energy, which provided the mechanism, the energy needed to bring the chemicals together, and they formed what were called amino acids. Now, these are called the building blocks of life because they link up to form proteins. And it said because supposedly random processes could have formed the amino acids, therefore life could have formed this way on early Earth. And the students are led systematically to a belief that scientists now know how life formed. And it's implied, if not stated, that in the textbook. So I thought, well, if I'm going to fair, you have to do science, you've got to try things. So let's add explosive energy to the magic can of evolution. And I happen to have some firecrackers here. Isn't science fun? Okay, so we'll light the firecracker, let her drop in the can, wait. We blow the lid off the can. Now, then, if you're going to do an experiment, you got to see what the results are. Have the parts of the pin come back. Oh man, and you hate it when this happens, but sure enough, there's the parts of the pin reassembled by an explosion. Now, I know many of you watching this, you're just laughing. You know that that's absolutely ridiculous. There is no possibility that could be true. As you know, you've already guessed, there were 2 pins in the can. I just pulled out the previously assembled pin. Now, just think about this for a moment. What was so ridiculous that it's laughable that explosive energy could cause perfectly designed complex parts to come together to form a working mechanism is taught as an absolute fact throughout our education system. And yet in the case of life, you have to have hundreds of parts that don't occur naturally, all coming together to form perfectly formed amino acids, where you line up the parts in a specific sequence, which statistically could never happen in nature. It's 1,000,000 times more ridiculous to believe life could form in this way than what was laughable, the idea that a firecracker could bring a pin together. You understand, we as Christians have to explain the truth to the next generation, that what they're hearing in their classrooms, in their museums, simply could not be true. And the very understanding of the design of nature shows us that this is the case. We've now traveled to a different location to look at another object. And we're going to determine, using our 5 criteria, is this object a naturally formed structure, or is it an intelligently designed structure? Well, if you look over my shoulder, I think you now know exactly what we're looking at. We're at Mount Rushmore. And let's apply our 5 criteria to this. First of all, is this carving behind me, is it made of multiple parts that come together to form a recognizable whole? Well, obviously it is. It's the carved eyes and ears and nose and so on form a face. The second criteria, as you look closer and closer at the structure, is it even more finely and intricately crafted? And again, you'll see the crafting marks in the carvings of the workmen as they carved this mountain face. Becomes even more intricate as you look closer. So that also fits the criteria of a designed, intelligent structure. Third, is it beautiful? Well, again, yeah, it is a beautiful carving on the mountain, a result of intelligent design. The fourth criteria, are the parts, do they fit together as non-functioning parts to create a working whole? In other words, brush strokes on a painting don't show or mean anything, but they come together to form a beautiful work of art. Well, Mount Rushmore, it has a nose, which is really a functioning thing, ears, eyes, so on. So in a way, the parts themselves are functioning. And last, is it made of a material or things that do not occur naturally? Well, it's carved out of rock. Rock occurs naturally, so that doesn't fit. It could be natural or it could be man-made. So that probably doesn't fit the criteria either. In other words, of the 5 criteria that could be used to determine is something intelligently designed, Mount Rushmore fits 3 of them. And yet, obviously, it is very definitely an intelligent designed object, and you would immediately know it when you look at it. This didn't occur naturally. Now compare that with life, whether it's a single bacteria or a human body. It's made up of millions of individual parts. And all of the parts are needed before you could have a functioning form of life of any sort. All the parts have to be there. So that fits the criteria of design. As you look closer and closer on a molecular level at life, it becomes even more intricately designed than the large lumbering animal that's walking through the woods. Fits the criteria of design. Beauty. Oh, absolutely. Every form of life is a masterpiece of beauty and craftsmanship. Do the individual parts occur naturally? They actually don't in the case of life. See, the molecules of life only occur inside of living organisms. You don't find them out there in the natural world. And lastly, the individual parts, are they alive? And they just come together to form another functioning form of life? No, they're non-living. Life is made from a bunch of parts that aren't alive. So in the case of life, all 5 criteria fit the fact there has to be an intelligent design behind it. With Mount Rushmore, only 3 of the criteria fit the idea that it was intelligently designed, and yet it's obvious it was intelligently designed. God has made it overwhelmingly obvious. Life requires a creator, an intelligent designer. So how do biologists get around this, get around to the reality that life has a designer? Well, they do it by saying, well, life has an appearance of design, and the mechanisms of evolution are what created that appearance of design. Mutations and natural selection created the design. Well, let's look at those 2 things, mutations and natural selection, and see, could they create life? But first, I want to just mention, the very words natural selection are actually a misnomer. The idea of natural selection is, as in the environment changes, an animal that is a little better at adapting in that environment will have an advantage and fill that environment and change to fit a different situation. In other words, if a fish has offspring, some like warm water, some like cold water, and they've actually done scientific papers on this example. The fish that like the warm water will adapt better there. They'll take over that environment, and soon all of that type of fish will live in that area, and the cold water fish won't even be found. So they have evolved the ability to live in warm water, is what's taught in the textbooks. Now, that's the idea that a change in the environment can cause an animal to change, and it's called natural selection. But nature can't select anything. Nature has no mind. And furthermore, nature can't cause the DNA code to change. You see, in reality, the DNA code is a programming that God built into every biological type of life, so it can vary and fit into environmental niches. Has nothing to do with the environment changing the animal. It's the animal had the ability to begin with to fit into different environments. But let's look at natural selection and see, could natural selection ever change one animal into a completely different kind of animal. And to do this, we're going to use an illustration that I like called the Little Red Wagon. Now, Dr. John Sanford wrote one of the most significant books on biological genetics ever written in the last probably 100 years. It's called Genetic Entropy. I strongly recommend this book, and this illustration comes from that book. But it's about a little red wagon. Now, I like to use stories as I illustrate things, so I'd like to start from the beginning. You know, when I was little, I absolutely loved my little red wagon. I went everywhere in my little red wagon. You know, I'd ride around in my little red wagon, but as my friends grew, they got bicycles, but I'm still riding in my little red wagon. And they got cars eventually, but I'm still riding around in my little red wagon. Because you see, I grew up in the 1960s, and Star Trek ruled in the 60s. And what I really wanted to ride in was the Starship Enterprise. Now, I brought my little red wagon for illustrations. You see, the difference between my little red wagon and the Starship Enterprise is like the difference between a single-celled bacteria in the human body. I mean, to turn a bacteria into a body, you've got to add enormous amounts of information. You've got to add bones and skin. You've got to add organs and hearts, livers, brains. You've got to add circulatory systems and blood vessels. Enormous, a mountain of information, new, complex, interrelated, functioning information to the DNA code to turn a wagon into a rocket ship. Now, how is that going to happen? Every time an organism has an offspring, there are these random changes called mutations. Every offspring of every organism is going to be a little different than the original because our DNA is exactly like a book. And it's like taking the book and randomly marking out a few letters. Like our DNA code is 3 billion letters long. A simple single-celled organism has about 1 million letters, which is smaller than billions of letters in the human code. So you've got to add all this information to turn a bacteria into a person. But as that information is added by random changes, it's like marking out the letters of a book. Well, they would say if these changes have a useful function, that bacteria becomes more functional, slowly parts are added, it'll eventually, over billions of years, change one animal into another, and the bacteria turned into a person. So we're going to look at our wagon as an example of, could the wagon turn into a spaceship, as an analogy of could a bacteria turn into a person. So our wagon, he rolls off the assembly line. Now, in order to make the next generation of wagon, you actually have to take all the information from the first wagon to rebuild the entire factory to make the second wagon. That's what life does. It takes the information from the DNA code, rebuilds the whole structure of the cell in order to make the very next cell. Now, you'll notice this wagon actually has a book attached underneath. That is like the DNA code. Now, what happens? The wagon rolls off the assembly line, and inside the book is page after page after page after page of information needed to build the wagon. Now, every generation of wagons, there are going to be copying errors, mutational mistakes. It's like taking this book, and I'm going to mark out a letter right here. And then I might turn over 10 pages, and I will take a word, and I'll move it from right here, and then I'll move the word down to a different spot. Might turn over another 10 pages, mark out an entire word. Move over another 10 pages, mark out a single letter. And let's suppose if the book is 1,000 pages long, I have only changed, say, 10 letters or words. Think about this. If you've ever read a book and you come across a page and there's one misspelled word, can you still understand the book? Is the book still functional? Well, I think everybody would say absolutely. Yeah, it's true. So 10 mistakes in 1,000 pages is not going to prevent this book from being understandable and usable, and the next factory that's built using that book will probably function perfectly fine, and off will roll the second wagon. You see, that's the way mutations are. There are so many mechanisms in a cell to correct the mistakes that very few of them or even noticeable. They're insignificant mutations. About 99.99% of mutations, they seem to have neither a positive nor a negative effect. But the third wagon will now have 20 mistakes. The fourth wagon will have 40 mistakes. 10 wagons later, there'll be 100 mistakes out of 1,000 pages. 100 wagons later, there'll be 1,000 mistakes. A mistake on every single page. 1,000 wagons later, there would be 10,000 mistakes. 10 mistakes on every page. Now, the quality control department is like what is coined natural selection. The quality control department, it looks at the wagon and it says, is this wagon going to sell well in the market? It's got wheels, they spin, it's got its handle, it's painted the right color, off it goes to market. Is it going to sell well? If it sells well, it's because it's constructed well. Natural selection did its job. The quality control department did its job. Natural selection, so-called, can't see the DNA code. It can't see changes. It can't make corrections. It can only see, does this animal function well? Well, think about what's going to happen after 1,000 generations, after 10,000 generations. That book is going to be turned to gobbledygook. After a while, wagons are going to come off and the wheels are going to be falling off. The quality control department will throw those wagons out, but the ones that get through are going to have a continuing building up of mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. And eventually, there's going to be so many mistakes, no wagons can pass. The animal will go extinct. You understand that right now, the human genome has over 4,000 identified genetic errors, because every generation has more mistakes than the generation before. As we go forward in time, your children are going to have more mistakes than you have. You have more mistakes than your grandparents had. That means as you went back in time, there were less and less and less mistakes. That's why people live for hundreds of years early on in creation. Because early on, closer to Adam and Eve, there were less mistakes. And as you look in the Bible, you see lifetimes dropping off through time because these mistakes have built up and built up and built up. Now, here's what kids are shown in schools. They'll be shown examples of animals that have mutated, bacteria that have mutated, and they seem to have an advantage. And they'll say, see, this proves natural selection can change one animal into a completely different kind of animal. Well, honestly, the pre-programming of the DNA code explains most of this variation and most of this adaptation, not the mutations or natural selection. But even if a mutation did result in a change that was useful in a certain environment, that doesn't prove that it's driving things upwards. It would be like the word red in the instruction manual to build this wagon being changed randomly to the word blue. It could happen. It is statistically possible. The blue wagon might sell really well in the market, but you see, that doesn't stop the downward deterioration that would have went with that blue wagon. And ultimately, it's going to continue to deteriorate downwards and go extinct. And could this process of randomly changing the letters ever turn this wagon into the Starship Enterprise? It is obvious. You see, God has made the truth obvious. These processes that are promoted as explaining evolution do not explain how one animal could ever change into a totally different body structure. So now let's look at the second supposed mechanism which causes evolution to change animals, and that's mutations. Now, you hear mutations all the time. They're the very basis for a wildly popular set of movies where they have occasional mutations which gives them superpowers and so on. But could mutations add functioning, useful characteristics to a creature? Well, the best analogy I've been able to come up with what a mutation can and can't do involves a simple flash drive or memory stick. Now, when memory sticks first came out, they were quite expensive, and I have an old 512 megabyte memory stick. Now, today, that's a useless piece of junk. We have memory sticks that hold 300 times as much information in the same amount of space. But, you know, being rather a frugal person, I didn't want to go out and buy a new memory stick. I mean, this thing cost, and you're going to laugh at this, when they first came out, they were very expensive. I paid, as I recall, somewhere between $50 and $100 for this little 512 megabyte memory stick. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I will mutate, I'll add a mutation to my memory stick, and maybe it'll become improved, maybe it'll work better. So I decided to add my first mutation. I took a nail and I decided I'm going to drive a nail through my memory stick to see if it improves its performance. Okay, so we have our first nail driven into our memory stick. Now, natural selection would be like taking this memory stick, plugging it in and seeing does it work better now or not. Now, obviously it's not going to work better, it's not going to become an improved memory stick, but you understand it is, in an enormous period of time, feasible. I mean, maybe the nail could connect a couple circuits that didn't used to be connected, and somehow this could cause some variation in its performance if the nail was exactly positioned just right and you did it millions and billions of times. And that's the kind of thought process people have, as they think, well, maybe mutations provide change which could improve things. So, you know, as a scientist, I'll continue the process and we'll add another mutation. After a while, this is what you end up with. Someone would put me in a straitjacket and lock me away in an insane asylum if I wanted to say this process of driving nails through a set of electronic circuitry is what caused a memory stick to develop to begin with. And yet that's exactly what's taught throughout the education system in America. Mutations, random changes to a fully functional information coded system in DNA is what caused the DNA code in all forms of life to have developed. This process of mutations or natural selection could never scientifically transform one creature into another creature. You see, there are two major problems with the belief in evolution, and shame on Christians for accepting it as if it is real science or actually true. First of all, it totally and directly contradicts what God has told us in His Word. He said 10 times in the first chapter of the Bible, creatures reproduce after their own kind. That means one totally different kind of creature never has turned into a completely different kind of creature. And second, the mechanisms proposed for evolution simply scientifically do not work to explain why life exists or how it could have developed. And we've got to get these facts in front of our kids in a clear, understandable way so they know God's Word is trustworthy and they're being deceived by a world who starts by assuming God's Word is not right and therefore simply has to come up with some other explanation for why things exist. I believe anybody who is remotely honest with themselves about the problems that mutations or natural selection have in explaining the upward advancement of life would have to ask themselves, then why is this belief so pervasive that natural selection and mutations are what caused this advancement of life? Well, the problem is when something is repeated over and over and over and over again, our brain forms a framework of reality and everything is filtered through that. So contradictions to the idea that this is what caused the advancement of life simply become invisible to what are essentially honest researchers, because their brain has convinced them this is reality. Now, lest you think that doesn't happen to all of us, I want to show you a little clip from a science film that shows how a very common object that all of us see repeatedly, tens of thousands of times, has formed a filter of reality in our brain to the point we can't see this object in any other way.
In this figure, the two ends obviously are parallel, but the two sides are not parallel because the two ends are not the same length. This figure we call a trapezoid. Now let's remove the cover. Are you a bit confused? Well, all we've done is cut some holes in the figure and painted it to look like a window frame. But maybe you say, well, you can't fool me, that's still a trapezoid. Well, it's still a trapezoid, all right. But now let's revolve the figure and see what happens. Does the window frame seem to turn, then stop, and reverse directions? Well, such is not the case. It is revolving continuously in a clockwise direction. Now, even when we know this, the illusion still persists, and it looks more like a window all the time. Well, maybe you need a reference point. See if the cube will help you follow the edge of the trapezoid all the way around. Watch closely now. Doesn't help a bit, does it? Not only does the trapezoid still oscillate back and forth, but the cube actually seems to take off and go floating through space. Now, it doesn't, of course. Actually, the cube has been firmly attached to the edge of the figure all the time. Now, an iron bar should make a good solid reference point. Let's see what happens now when we rotate the window. Of course, we know that the revolving window frame cannot possibly bend the iron bar or cause it to cut through the window frame. But this knowledge seems to be of no help at all. The illusion of an oscillating window still continues. From earliest childhood, it has been our experience that windows are rectangles and that all sides are parallel. Your eye sent an accurate image to the brain, the image of a trapezoid painted like a window. But your mind said, ah, that's a window. And rather than give up the idea that all windows are rectangular, your mind accepted all sorts of improbable things. Solid bars bending or cutting through solid matter without even leaving a hole.
Now, I want to make sure you really understand what you just saw. You see, your brain saw that window going around and around and around. It just refused to let you interpret it that way. It saw that block going around and around. It didn't see it floating through air. It saw that bar going around and around, not cutting through the window. But in order to keep the image in your mind looking like a window, it pretended things were floating through space or cutting through solid matter. And it wouldn't let you see it any other way. They actually showed this same video to a group of people from Africa, and they asked them, what do you see? And these people said, well, we saw that object going around and around and around. We saw that block attached to it going around and around and around. We saw that bar going around and around. See, their brain hadn't been conditioned to think in only a certain way, so it saw what was actually right in front of their face. That's how strongly preconceptions can blind us to the truth. That's the tragedy of sending children through a school system where they're only allowed to hear one possible viewpoint of where they came from, that natural processes made them all. And they hear this superficial explanation of small changes filtered by their advantage could cause an animal to turn into another, and they'll just accept it as true because they never get to hear the problems with it or any other alternative, to the point where it becomes their filter of truth. And even as they become professors and biologists and geneticists, they become blinded to any other possibility. God's Word warns us of this over and over again. It says, make my Word the foundation, the lamp unto your feet, and the light unto your path. Because if we don't do this, if we don't make God's Word that light before us, we will become blinded to the obvious when it's right in front of our faces. So I implore Christians trust what God has told us and apply that to the world around us. And eventually, we'll start to see the window as it really is instead of as our brain wants to make it. We've been trained to see it in the wrong way. This session has been all about design and how everywhere we look in the biological world we see a phenomenally well thought out design to the macro level of the entire universe. And yet evolutionary thought, which permeates our entire education system, denies that this design has a designer. The very definition of modern science has been changed to mean the study of the world around us to determine the natural processes that had created it. So it leaves out the possibility of a designer. And yet, can you get the complex design of life based on just random processes and random things? Now, what evolutionists will say is, of course, look at snowflakes. Snowflakes have phenomenal design and an infinite variety. So if you can have design in something as simple as a snowflake, well, that explains how there could be design in life. Or they'll say, you know, maybe on an ancient clay, which had a certain electrostatic property, chemicals collected and formed designs. Why, even if you throw out Scrabble letters, occasionally you'll see a word form, and therefore more complex words would form. See, that is their response to the idea that random processes couldn't produce design, that yes, we do see designs. But here's the issue. If you go to biology, the very chemicals that the very simplest forms of life are made out of, the enzymes, the proteins, the polypeptides, they aren't even found in nature. They don't occur. They are only made by life. If you mix the 4 chemicals that are made in DNA to line up the DNA code, and you just throw them in a test tube, they don't line up into a DNA molecule that has the spiral shape we find in life. It only occurs within life. So right from the get-go, the idea design could make itself doesn't make sense because the very raw materials aren't occurring naturally. They only are formed inside of fully functional forms of life. But honestly, there's an even bigger problem than that, and that is the interrelated interconnectiveness of things to make a whole. You see a Boeing 747, an enormous jet, it is made of millions of non-flying parts, and yet the airplane itself flies. We talked about this. The individual parts don't, but the final one does. Let's look at it in another way in this rebuttal of the idea design of life could have made itself. Let's consider a puzzle. If you look at any puzzle, there's a picture on the front of the puzzle and you follow the picture in order to make the puzzle. Well, as scientists are trying to determine where did stars come from, where did the universe and galaxies come from, where did the rock layers come from, where did life come from, they don't have a picture to follow. They're just looking at the pieces and trying to figure out where they came from. It would be like taking a puzzle that you hope to put together and you got to spray paint out the picture on the front and spray paint out all the picture, so you don't have anything to follow. You don't have a guide that's going to tell you where it came from. It's just a big black void. And then you've got to open up the puzzle and you've got all of these pieces. Now, what's the first thing you do when you put together a puzzle? Well, I mean, typically you look for the edge pieces. But a scientist trying to figure out where everything came from, he doesn't have any edge pieces. It's like taking the puzzle and you got to throw out all the edge pieces. Every time you find an edge piece, they don't exist. They've just got to be gone. And then you're trying to figure it out. You've got a few pieces of the puzzle, and maybe they're over here in geology. And you've got another few pieces of puzzle, and maybe you find them out here in astronomy somewhere. You got another few pieces of the puzzle, and you find them over in biology. But they're just scattered everywhere, and when you start to piece them together, they don't necessarily fit your preconceptions that everything made itself. So what are you going to do? Well, you take your handy dandy knife and you got to start shaping the puzzles to fit your worldview. And you take another piece and you kind of slice it off and just carve a new little round spot, and then maybe you can get it to fit. And you have to do this with hundreds and hundreds of pieces because they don't fit the natural view you have that everything made itself. And then you start to put the puzzle together. Now, what are the chances you're ever going to get the puzzle to look like what it's supposed to look like, what it really is, to look like reality? You're not, because you don't have all the pieces. They're coming from different areas. You've thrown away the edge pieces. You don't have a cover on the box, and you're modifying the parts to fit your preconceived worldview. You're starting assumptions. Do you understand what God has done? He has created all of this world. He has given us this gorgeous design of creation. But then He gave us the picture on the front of the box. It's called God's revealed revelation to mankind, the Bible. And in the first 3 chapters of the Bible, it tells us where everything came from. It tells us when it was created. It tells us who the source of it is. It tells us in chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9 of Genesis why the rock layers look the way they do, because there's been a world restructuring flood. But if you leave all that out of your thinking, it is literally like taking a can of spray paint and spraying the picture on the front of the box, and then cutting up the puzzle pieces to fit your preconceived views. You leave out God's Word, you're going to misinterpret it, guaranteed. So that's what's going on. This idea that little simple designs we find in nature explain the big picture is foolishness, because they don't even explain where the parts of the biological world came from.